and welcome! In this week's Sims 4 Speed Build, we are journeying back in time and we are building a Viking village. Yep, this is going to be one epic build because not only is this a no CC build, we are also on a 64 by 64 lot in Windenburg, so the largest lot possible. I have a major issue with these big builds. I get myself into trouble a lot with these. But hello and welcome to the Viking Ages. We are in the year about 800 to 1100 AD, and this fell into part of the Dark Ages, but the Vikings, I mean, they were known for their raids and their colonization of parts of Europe, and you probably heard of a good amount of very famous Vikings, and some of them are Leif Erikson. So Leif Erikson actually made it to North America 500 years before Christopher Columbus. Ragnar Lothbrok, yes, the main character of the Vikings show, was a real Viking. And Harold Bluetooth. Bluetooth? Yeah, that Bluetooth, the technology that links all of our devices together. That technology was named after the 10th century Danish king. And here's a really cool fun fact. So the Bluetooth symbol was created by combining the Danish runes H and B together. Pretty awesome, huh? Now maybe you learned something new now. Just a cool, fun little fact. But right now, we are building one of our longhouses, and the longhouse was one of the most popular styles of architecture during the Viking Age. Unfortunately, I did not build it as large as I would have liked, so the average longhouse was about 30 meters by 8 meters. So I mean, there's some that were smaller, some that were larger, and it basically depended on your social status and how well you were doing in life, depended on how big your longhouse was. And then you might ask, okay, well, why were these things so huge? Well, guess what? If you were a Viking, you'd be living with your extended family. So your parents, their siblings, their kids, everyone's kids, grandparents, everyone all lived together, so you needed a lot of space. And typically in these longhouses, towards the back, animals would also be kept, and then usually that's where the slaves would stay. Slaves and animals towards the back. In this build, I did not do it that way just because of having to save space. I could have made a giant longhouse on this lot and that could have been it, but I wanted to kind of squeeze some other stuff in there and make it actually come to life. So yes, this is not as big as I would like. And I will say, like, some of the things I'm adding for like decoration, I'm just purely kind of fantasizing and I want it to look good in the game. But okay, so right now, this longhouse is rectangular, which is kind of the shape of how they were actually, but archaeologists have found that they kind of bowed out in the middle, and some of the roofs were basically like if you took a ship and you flipped it upside down, that's how the roof would look, and then that's kind of how the whole structure looked. And for you Sims builders, you know that's not really possible to do in the game. I kind of played around with off camera, seeing if I could make the roof look like that, and it's like, yep, no, it's not happening. So unfortunately, we're not doing that with this build, but I mean, we're trying to get it looking somewhat like it should look. But okay, the size and the shape of these builds, so there's not really much evidence left from the Vikings because they built with a lot of wood and other items that broke down. But the cool thing is with some of these archaeological digs is the archaeologists were able to see where these giant post holes were sunk, and then they were able to map this out and gauge the size and see the shape of these places, which is really cool. And I'll say something you might have noticed on the exterior of this was these slanted posts kind of coming in at the building, and you might be wondering, what was that? So this is kind of a controversial thing in the community. Some people think that these posts were used for support, and others think that, well, I should say, some think that they were vertical and some think that they were slanted, and there's not really any way of knowing. But the thing is, if these posts were used like on a slant like this would basically kind of classify them as buttresses, which if you've seen my first speed build, you will know what buttresses are. We talked about flying buttresses. Yeah. But these buttresses, basically what they did was help take some load off the walls or the roof, and it just, yeah, it basically took that weight off, put it towards the ground. So I think it's very plausible that this was done. Something else that was kind of new to this era was trusses, and the Vikings used trusses in their roof, which was really interesting. So I'm not a structural engineer. I don't know like the weight of these roofs, and with going higher, if that would have created a lot more stress on the walls. I do know that living in a colder climate, also there is a lot of freezing, thawing, the ground moves a lot, and maybe this was very practical and was very useful with, I can't imagine having the greatest foundations. In some builds, the Vikings did use stones as foundations, but how great is that compared to stuff we have nowadays? I mean, foundations we have nowadays are just, it's progressed a lot. So so our big longhouse here, we have those buttresses, and I did design some other smaller longhouses without, so we're getting a good representation, I feel like, of possibilities. And this big longhouse is more of the dining hall. I did not put in any bedrooms. This isn't like a living area. Towards the back, I did add some bathrooms because, once again, we cannot have stinky Sims walking around. I'll say, there's a toilet and there's a bathtub and there is a sink, and this is all stuff that can function off the grid. I forgot to turn on that aspect of the, like, I don't know, the challenge. I haven't really tested it out, but everything I used is off the grid friendly. So that's one aspect. And some of the houses, the smaller houses, will not have bathrooms. Okay, I'll address this. This was kind of the cool thing about the Vikings. They did have indoor toilets. Nothing fancy. They were thought to have used like sawdust, dirt, whatever to go onto. But I mean, that's a big plus when you're living somewhere super cold and you don't have to go outside to do your business. That's great. So I did add in some bathrooms. I think a couple of the houses do not have them, and we have our bushes that I put around on this build, so your sim can go pee in the bush or do whatever in the bush if they need to. I tried to make this very usable, but also kind of trying to keep it realistic. Yeah, the dining hall. You don't want to talk about the dining hall? Well, so besides the bathrooms, we have big areas for feasting. I have a bar set up in here. I have, what else? Oh, I had the like gravy fountain. I figured this is a place for celebrations and that would be fun, so I put that in. And let's talk a little bit about the interiors of these longhouses, and that'll kind of get into what I want to talk about next. So when you move on to the inside of these longhouses, a very common feature was that open fire pit fireplace in the middle of the house. And I did that in most of these longhouses, except one I put in like the big cauldron because I figured that would be kind of good for cooking. But I did playtest all these fireplaces, fire pits, they all work, which is really awesome. So when you light all the fires. It looks super cool, and you will be able to cook meals over the fire. I was super excited that that ended up working out, because that was something I really wanted to keep with like the traditional setup of the longhouse. So that's one item with like traditional longhouses. Something I was not able to add in is a hole in the roof above that fire pit for ventilation. I can't really do that, but that was something that was done back then. I don't know how well that worked for ventilation. The roofs were higher, you know, smoke would all kind of go everywhere, and I don't know how much would escape out that hole. So might be a little bit smoky in these places. So we'll just pretend that there's a hole above these fire pits in the Sims build. We'll just pretend. Something else, I'm like, you can see the beds going in here. Beds and benches would be alongside these walls in the longhouses. So it looks a little funky and weird in The Sims, but I was really trying to keep this as historical as possible with some of the setup. I didn't want to stray too much from historical evidence. So if you're wondering why all the beds are pushed against the walls like this, that is why. If I could have put in a bunch of benches that we could have turned into beds, I would have done that, but this is how it turned out, and I do think it looks pretty cool. And if you look at reference pictures for like recreations of Viking buildings and houses, which I had to, it looks pretty similar to this. So that was another thing. Something else that's really interesting about Viking villages. You ready for it? So obviously they liked using wood a lot in building. So much so that they used wood for their roads, which to me is crazy. It seems like a lot of work to get a wooden road and then to have that against the ground. I don't imagine that that would last very long. And it had me thinking, wow, if that was done today, I don't think we'd have any trees left. That would take so many trees. I mean, obviously, these paths are very narrow, but I will say that too. So when you're watching the build later and you're like, what is with these funky wood paths? I was trying to be historically accurate on this. Want to hear another fun fact? So a lot of people, when they envision Vikings, think of the stereotypical helmet with horns. And the interesting thing about this was this is not historically proven that Vikings wore these helmets. So then obviously, yeah, you're wondering too, Flynn, right? Well, okay, then why are all Vikings shown with these helmets? So we can thank the Germans for this. The Germans had a huge fascination for a while with the Vikings and their lore and mythology. And one of the German operas of the time during the 1800s was Der Ring des Nibelungen. So in this opera, the costume designer decided that they wanted to use this horned helmet in the Viking costumes. And then this also just tells you how popular this opera was, since this carried through history all the way to our day, which is crazy. And I don't know, for those of you that have watched a decent amount of cartoons, a lot of cartoons will kind of make fun of a bigger woman opera singer in Viking clothing with that helmet. So here you go. It's going all the way back to the 1800s and this opera. And one of the very famous pieces that you would probably recognize from this opera was the Ride of the Valkyries. Very, very famous piece of music. And if you haven't heard it before, look it up, and maybe you'll be surprised if you listen to it and you'll be like, yep, I've heard that before. So yeah, the Vikings have had a huge impact on history, that's for sure. So yeah, that was just like some fun little historical stuff for Viking Age, and we can talk a little bit more about the build. I know otherwise you're kind of wondering what is going on here. So we are in another one of the longhouses. So we have our big giant longhouse as the dining hall. We have two little smaller houses, and then we have two like slightly larger longhouses, and then on the beach we have like a little fishing house. So we will get to that a little bit later. So these medium-sized longhouses, I did put a nice fancy bedroom in the back, and I also put a bathroom into these. I figured these are the more wealthy people living here, and these can be a little nicer. The other ones were a little bit smaller, they don't have as much money. You will see kind of scattered around here, I put in some farming stuff. So we have some chickens. I really wanted to get a cow in here. There was just not room. I haven't sized down the barn yet, so I don't know if it would work if I size that down and then put the cow in. But we have chickens. We have a huge patch for growing vegetables. The pond, I'll say like pond, I put fish in there. You can go fishing. There's a couple areas to go fishing. So I feel like this lot would be very functional. You could just stay at this lot, and if you wanted to do like a historical playthrough, I don't think you'd really have to leave this lot. Although I have considered, do I take the rest of this island in Windenburg and make it all Viking related? It would be really, really cool, and it's very tempting. And after building this, I'm like, I really want to play this lot. I really want to play. So I don't know. I'm hoping that you guys are liking this, and I don't know, maybe some of you will be inspired to go and play a historical playthrough with this. I really do think it would be fun. I haven't seen any like Viking challenges out there. You'll have to let me know if you've seen any. I think that would be, like I said, I think that'd be really fun. I will say, thankfully we have swords in the base game, which I was also thinking, somebody's got to tell me this. Why do we have swords in the base game? I know there was some sword fighting that was introduced with Get Famous, but they were popping up as base game. So it made me wonder, wait, what interaction are Sims using swords for? I don't know. All I know is like, yes, there was swords, and then I had to recreate shields. So I was kind of telling my husband about like some of the things I was doing. We have more like medieval European swords and shields that are in the base game, and then there's also one that came with Get Famous. But the Vikings had these circular shields, so I had to make my own shields, which took a lot of time. Which, oh yeah, I forgot to mention, which you will see, I built a Viking Longship, which was difficult. I used some boats that were in debug, and then I had to basically like kind of change the shape. And then why I say that is because I had to create a ton of shields to put on the side of this, and it took a while. And I did some different versions of the shields. Some are like, okay, some I used some wood panels from Snowy Escape, and then other ones I use from Journey to Batu that are like metal, but they kind of look wood, so I used that. And yes, I used a decent amount of Star Wars Journey to Batu in this because I needed to. Just for the skull, like seriously, even just for the skull. I actually used a decent amount. It fit in really well with this. Star Wars kind of has a really interesting aesthetic to it. I think it's pretty fun. I think it's cool because it can go with a lot of different builds. And to me, that's a sign of a good pack, even though I know people weren't into that. But for building, yeah, totally worth it. Yeah, so I think there's 22 shields in total on this ship. Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, even with Tool, it wasn't very easy just because things didn't want to place right over the water, and I had to turn shields and get them close to the ship, and it was just, I'm a perfectionist, so it took me a really long time. I also forgot to mention that besides having like the little fisherman's house, we also have a boathouse, and it's basically just a roof. But the boathouses also had that really interesting like boat hull kind of roof, and I was able to do that with the boathouse. So I snuck at least like one of those style roofs in here, which is kind of cool. You'll see that later. Something else I will also say, so obviously I said this is a no CC build, but for the cinematography, I needed to download some custom content for proper clothing and costumes and hair. So if you see that and you're like, wait, I thought this was CC free, it is, and none of that stuff obviously interferes with the build, but I just couldn't have my Sims looking ridiculous, like they didn't fit in. I have a feeling there's some stuff that you could use from the game that could make them look kind of Viking-ish. That'd be really cool to see some Sims with just purely like Sims content, no CC Viking outfits. But I, like I said, I'm a perfectionist, and it needed to look like really realistic, and I wanted it to really come to life. And then, I mean, that's something, if you are not opposed to CC or you are on PC and you can have CC, it's something you can always do. You can download some of these really cool outfits and hairs, which will be linked in the description. And there is some Viking custom content out there. I really wished I could have used the Viking shields because they look so good. So if you download this and if you don't want the tool-made shields, you can go ahead and replace that with the CC ones that look amazing. Yeah, I had a really hard time deciding if I was going to do CC for this build. And the thing is, when I do these really elaborate and different and historical builds, I really want them to be custom content free so everyone can play them. And it's a good challenge for me. I really, really have a lot of fun doing builds like this and having to get super creative. What? But anyways, like I said, don't forget to stick around to the end because there's some cinematography. There is always pictures of the build so you can see everything laid out really nicely. I know it's sometimes hard to follow during the speed build, so you can get a really good picture of how everything looks. But yeah, we are getting towards the end, so we're gonna wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first time or you're a returning viewer, we thank you very much. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up. Give us a like, don't forget to subscribe, turn on those notifications, and we will see you again next week, everyone. Bye!